The temple vessels are built, the priestly garments are sewn, the red heifers are in Israel, and now a high priest has been chosen and trained. Every single piece is in place. The only question left is, how much time do we have? Because what is happening right now in Jerusalem is not a rumor. It is not speculation. It is documented. It is real. And it connects directly to a prophecy written over 2,500 years ago by a man named Daniel. A prophecy that describes exactly what we are watching unfold, right now, in our generation. Most people have no idea this is happening. But by the end of this video, you will, and nothing will look the same after this. To understand why this moment is so significant, we need to go back, way back. In ancient Israel, the high priest was not just a religious title. He was the most important man in the entire nation. He was the only person on earth allowed to walk into the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple, the place where God's presence dwelled, and he could only do it once a year. On Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, he would enter alone, carrying the blood of a sacrifice, to stand before God on behalf of every single person in Israel. One man, one day, one chance. If he did it wrong, he died. That is how serious this role was. But then, it all stopped. In 70 AD, the Roman army marched into Jerusalem. They tore down the Second Temple stone by stone, and with it, the entire priesthood system collapsed. No temple, no sacrifices, no high priest. For nearly 2,000 years, that role simply did not exist. Until now. Because here is what most people are missing. Hidden quietly in Jerusalem, a group has spent decades preparing for this exact moment. They have been training real men, descendants of Aaron himself, teaching them the ancient rituals, the purification laws, the sacrificial procedures, everything required by the Torah. And from that group, one man has been selected, trained, prepared, and ready. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about why this matters so much. Because this is not just about Israel. This is not just about religion. This connects to a prophecy so specific, so detailed, that when you hear it, you will wonder how anyone could call this a coincidence. And that prophecy begins with one name: Daniel. Daniel was not an ordinary prophet. He lived over 2,500 years ago. He was taken from Jerusalem as a young man, carried off to Babylon as a captive. And yet, while sitting in a foreign land, God gave him visions of the future so detailed, so precise, that scholars have studied them for centuries. And one of those visions describes exactly what we are watching happen right now. It is found in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Here is what it says. A ruler will make a covenant with many nations for 7 years. But halfway through those 7 years, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And in the temple, he will set up something so terrible, so offensive to God, that it causes complete desolation. Now, stop right there. Did you catch that? Daniel describes a future temple, with daily sacrifices, with a functioning priesthood, operating just like it did in ancient times. And then, someone stops it. But here is the part that should make you pause. For those sacrifices to be stopped, they first have to be started. And for them to start, you need a temple, you need priests, and you need a high priest to lead them. 3 things that did not exist anywhere on earth, until right now. Think about that for a moment. Daniel did not write a vague prediction. He did not say, someday things might change. He described a specific sequence of events, a covenant, a temple, sacrifices, and then a desecration. And every single piece of that sequence is now being assembled. But Daniel's prophecy doesn't stand alone, because roughly 500 years after Daniel wrote those words, someone else referenced them, someone whose words carry even more weight: Jesus himself. In Matthew chapter 24, a disciple asks Jesus a simple question: what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And Jesus points them directly back to Daniel. He says, "When you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, then you will know." Jesus did not say if, he said when. That means Jesus himself confirmed that Daniel's prophecy about the temple, the sacrifices, and the desecration was still future, still coming, still waiting to be fulfilled. And here is what that means for us today. If Jesus pointed to Daniel, and Daniel pointed to a rebuilt temple with a functioning priesthood, and we are now watching a high priest being trained and prepared in Jerusalem, then we are not just watching history, we are watching prophecy, in real time. But there is still one major obstacle standing between where we are now and where Daniel said we would end up. One ancient requirement that must be met before any of this can move forward. And most people have never even heard of it. It involves a cow, a very specific cow, and the answer might shock you. Before we go any further, we need to talk about something that sounds simple on the surface, but when you understand what it means, it changes everything. A cow, not just any cow, a red heifer. Now before you scroll past that thought, stay with me, because this is where it gets remarkable. In the book of Numbers, chapter 19, God gave Israel a very specific instruction. Before any priest could perform sacred duties in the temple, before any sacrifice could be offered, a purification ritual had to take place. And that ritual required one thing: a red heifer, a young female cow, completely red, no blemishes, no defects. And here is the part that makes this almost impossible to fulfill. Not even 2 hairs on its entire body could be any other color. The animal had to be perfect. Once found, it would be sacrificed, burned completely, and its ashes would be mixed with water to create a purification solution. That solution would then be used to cleanse the priests and the temple grounds from ritual impurity. Without it, nothing else could happen. No purification, no priesthood, no sacrifices. The red heifer is not optional. It is not symbolic. It is a hard requirement written directly into the Torah. And for nearly 2,000 years, this ritual has been impossible to perform. Because there was no temple, there were no priests, and qualified red heifers are extraordinarily rare. Some Jewish scholars believe only 9 red heifers have ever met the requirements in all of human history. 9, in thousands of years. So what are the chances that right now, in our generation, multiple qualified red heifers would suddenly appear? Because that is exactly what has happened. In recent years, several red heifers were born that met the strict biblical requirements. And here is the part that stopped researchers in their tracks. Some of them were not born in Israel. They were born in Texas, in the United States. And then they were shipped to Israel. Think about that. Cattle ranchers in Texas, unknowingly raising animals that may fulfill a 3,500-year-old biblical requirement on the other side of the world. These heifers are now in Israel, being watched carefully, being examined regularly, waiting until they reach the right age, usually between 2 and 3 years old. And as of right now, some of them still qualify. The Temple Institute has confirmed they are monitoring these animals closely, because the moment one is deemed ready and the purification ceremony takes place, the priesthood will be ritually clean. And once the priesthood is clean, the sacrifices can begin. Now let that sink in for a moment. The high priest is trained and ready. The temple vessels are built. The priestly garments are prepared. And the red heifers are in Israel, waiting. Every single requirement is either already met or within reach. But here is the question nobody wants to ask out loud. If all of this is ready, what is actually stopping it? The answer to that question involves one of the most contested pieces of land on the entire planet. A location so sensitive, so loaded with history and conflict, that it sits at the center of wars, peace deals, and end-time prophecy, all at the same time. And what is planned for that location will absolutely stun you. There is a hill in Jerusalem that sits at the center of everything. It is called the Temple Mount, and right now, it is one of the most watched, most disputed, and most prophetically significant locations on the entire planet. Here is why. This is the exact spot where both the first and second temples stood. This is where the Holy of Holies was located. This is where the high priest entered once a year to stand before God. This is the ground that Daniel was writing about. This is the location that Jesus referenced in Matthew 24. And right now, sitting on that exact spot, is the Dome of the Rock, one of the most recognized Islamic shrines in the world, built in 691 AD, right on top of the most sacred ground in Judaism. And this is where the conflict becomes almost impossible to untangle, because both groups have deep historical and religious claims to this land, and the tension between those claims has fueled decades of conflict, multiple wars, and ongoing political battles that involve not just Israel, but the United States, the United Nations, and virtually every major power in the Middle East. Right now, under a carefully managed agreement, Jews are allowed to visit the Temple Mount, but they are not allowed to pray there. They are not allowed to perform any religious rituals there. The site is administered by an Islamic authority called the Waqf. That arrangement has held, but it is fragile, and it is being challenged more openly than ever before. In recent years, Israeli politicians and religious leaders have made increasingly bold statements about Jewish rights on the Temple Mount. Some have visited the site in ways that caused international incidents. Some have called openly for the rebuilding of the temple. And the Temple Institute, the same organization preparing the vessels, the garments, and the priesthood, has never been quiet about their ultimate goal. They want the third temple built, on that exact spot. Now here is where prophecy and current events collide in a way that is hard to ignore. Daniel's prophecy describes a covenant, an agreement made with many nations. Many scholars believe this will be some kind of peace deal or security arrangement involving Israel, and part of that arrangement may involve the Temple Mount itself. Could a future agreement give Israel the right to build, or at least begin preparations, on the Temple Mount? It sounds impossible. It sounds like something out of a movie. But 10 years ago, so did a lot of what we are watching right now. Because here is something most people do not know. There are serious scholars, architects, and religious leaders who have already drawn up detailed plans for the Third Temple. The blueprints exist. The location is identified. The materials are being gathered. They are not waiting for permission to plan. They are waiting for the moment to build. And that moment, according to Daniel, will be triggered by a covenant, a deal, an agreement that nobody saw coming. Which brings us to something happening right now in global politics that lines up with this in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Because the nations are talking, the deals are being discussed, and somewhere in those conversations, the future of the Temple Mount may already be on the table. But there is something else, something that connects all of this: the high priest, the red heifer, the Temple Mount, and Daniel's prophecy, into one single timeline. A timeline that suggests we are not years away from these events. We may be months away. And when you see how these pieces connect, you will understand why so many prophecy scholars are watching this moment, with a level of urgency they have never felt before. Let's stop for a moment and look at the full picture. Because when you lay out everything we have covered so far, side by side, the pattern that emerges is unlike anything seen in modern history. And it starts with a date that changed everything: 1948. After nearly 2,000 years of exile, Israel became a nation again, in a single day. Just like Isaiah 66 verse 8 said it would happen. A nation born in a day. Scholars called it impossible. History called it a miracle. Then came 1967. In 6 days, Israel fought off multiple surrounding nations and recaptured Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, The Jewish people had sovereign access to their most sacred ground. 6 days. That's all it took. Now fast forward to today. The Temple Institute has spent over 3 decades preparing every single item needed for temple worship. The golden menorah, the incense altar, the showbread table, the priestly garments, all of it, built to exact biblical specifications, ready and waiting. A high priest has been chosen and trained. Red heifers that meet the ancient biblical requirements are currently in Israel, and the political conversations surrounding Jerusalem and the Temple Mount are more active, more intense, and more globally watched than at any point in modern history. Now here is where it gets serious. Daniel's prophecy describes a final period of 7 years. Scholars call it the 70th week of Daniel. It begins with a covenant, a significant agreement involving Israel and many nations, and it ends with the return of Jesus Christ. But here is what most people overlook. Before that 7-year period even begins, the temple infrastructure has to be in place. The priesthood has to be functioning. The sacrifices have to be happening. Because Daniel tells us that halfway through those 7 years, the sacrifices will be stopped. You cannot stop something that has not started. So the question is not whether the temple will be rebuilt. According to Daniel, and according to Jesus, it will be. The question is, how close are we to the starting point? And when you look at the convergence of signs happening right now, that question becomes much harder to answer casually. Think about this. Every generation since 70 AD has watched and waited for these signs. Every generation hoped they might be the one to see it. But no generation, until ours, has seen a restored nation of Israel, a recaptured Jerusalem, a prepared priesthood, a trained high priest, and qualified red heifers all present at the same time. Not one generation in 2,000 years, until now. And yet, even with all of this in place, there is still one sign that has not yet appeared. One event that must happen before Daniel's final week can begin. And it is an event that the entire world will know about when it happens. Because it will not happen quietly. It will shake the Middle East. It will dominate global headlines. And it will divide nations overnight. Some believe the groundwork for that event is already being laid right now, behind closed doors, in conversations most of us will never hear about. But the outcome, if Daniel is right, will be impossible to miss. So what is that final trigger? What is the one event that starts the clock on Daniel's 70th week? And more importantly, what does it mean for every single person alive on earth today when it happens? Because the answer to that question is not just about Israel. It is not just about the Middle East. It is about every nation, every city, every family, including yours. And what comes next is something that prophecy scholars have debated for decades. But right now, for the first time, the debate is starting to feel less like theology and more like breaking news. Every major prophetic event in the Bible is triggered by something, a moment, a decision, an action that sets everything else in motion. And according to Daniel, the event that starts the final 7 years is a covenant. Daniel 9:27 says it plainly. A ruler will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week of years, 7 years. And that covenant, that agreement, is the starting gun. Now here is what most people get wrong about this. They assume this covenant has not happened yet. They assume it is something far off in the future, something we will recognize immediately when it comes. But what if it does not look the way we expect? What if it looks like a peace deal, a security agreement, a regional normalization treaty between Israel and its neighbors? Because right now, that is exactly what is being discussed. In recent years, the world has watched a series of historic agreements reshape the Middle East landscape. Nations that were once bitter enemies of Israel, signing normalization deals, opening embassies, establishing trade relationships. And with each new agreement, the circle of nations around Israel grows smaller. The isolation that defined Israel for decades is quietly dissolving. Now ask yourself this. If Daniel described a covenant involving Israel and many nations, and we are watching a string of agreements between Israel and surrounding nations, at what point does one of those agreements cross the line from diplomacy into prophecy? That is not a question with an easy answer, but it is a question we need to be asking, because here is what Daniel tells us happens after that covenant is confirmed. For the first 3.5 years, there is a period of relative peace. The temple is functioning, the sacrifices are happening, the world has exhaled, the deal is holding. But then, halfway through, everything changes. The ruler who confirmed the covenant breaks it. He enters the temple, he stops the sacrifices, and he sets up what Daniel calls the abomination of desolation, the most offensive act ever committed in a sacred space. Jesus warned about this moment specifically. In Matthew 24, he told his followers that when they see this happen, they should not even stop to grab their belongings. Just run. That is how serious this moment is. Now this is where the high priest becomes critically important again, because the abomination of desolation does not happen in an empty building. It happens in a functioning temple, with active worship, with daily sacrifices being performed by real priests, led by a high priest, the same role that has just been restored in our generation. Do you see how this connects? The high priest is ready. The vessels are prepared. The red heifers are in Israel. The political groundwork is being laid. And Daniel described all of it, 2,500 years ago. But here is the part of this prophecy that most videos never talk about. Because beyond the covenant, beyond the temple, beyond even the abomination of desolation, Daniel describes what happens at the end of those 7 years. And it is not destruction, it is not darkness, it is not defeat. It is the most anticipated moment in all of human history, the return of the one that Daniel called the Ancient of Days, the one that Jesus called the Son of Man, the one that Revelation describes riding on a white horse, with the armies of heaven behind him, the return of Jesus Christ. And here is what that means for every person watching this right now. If the covenant triggers the 7 years, and the 7 years ends with the return of Christ, then every sign we are watching right now is not just a sign of trouble ahead. It is a sign that the end of the story is closer than we think. And the end of this story is not a tragedy. For those who are ready, it is the moment everything was always pointing toward. But being ready requires something that no temple, no priesthood, and no red heifer can provide. And that is where this gets deeply personal. Because the most important question right now is not when the covenant will be signed. It is not when the temple will be built. It is not when the sacrifices will begin. The most important question is whether you are ready. And what it means to be ready is something that has been misunderstood by millions of people, even people who have been in church their whole lives. Because being ready is not about knowing the timeline. It is not about understanding the prophecy. It is not even about watching the signs. It is about something far more simple and far more profound. And in the final part of this video, we are going to talk about exactly that. Because if everything we have covered today is true, and the evidence suggests it is, then what comes next in your own life matters more than anything else we have discussed. But before we get there is one more piece of this puzzle that most prophecy teachers skip over entirely. A detail buried in the book of Revelation that connects directly to the high priest, the temple, and a moment that is coming that the world is completely unprepared for. And once you see it, you will never read these prophecies the same way again. Most people who study end-time prophecy focus on the big events: the Antichrist, the mark of the beast, the tribulation, the battle of Armageddon. And those things are real. They are coming. Daniel described them. Jesus confirmed them. Revelation details them with stunning precision. But there is a detail in Revelation that almost nobody talks about. A detail that connects directly to everything we have covered today. And when you see it, It reframes the entire conversation. It is found in Revelation chapter 11, and it starts with a simple instruction given to the Apostle John. Measure the temple. That is what John is told to do. Go and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and count the worshippers there. Now stop right there. John wrote Revelation around 95 AD. The second temple had already been destroyed. It had been gone for 25 years when John received this vision. And yet, in his vision of the future, there is a temple, standing, functioning, with worshippers inside. This is not a reference to a heavenly temple. The text is specific. It describes a physical location, a measurable structure, with an altar, with people worshiping inside it. In other words, Revelation confirms what Daniel already told us. The third temple will be built. But here is the detail that stops most readers cold. Immediately after John is told to measure the temple, he is told to leave out the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. 42 months. That is 3.5 years. The exact same period that Daniel describes as the second half of the final 7 years. The same period that begins when the Antichrist enters the temple and stops the sacrifices. Daniel saw it. Jesus confirmed it. And now John is measuring the very temple where it happens. 3 different writers, 3 different centuries. One single consistent picture. And that picture is being constructed right now, in Jerusalem, in our generation. But here is where Revelation adds something that Daniel and Matthew do not fully spell out. Right after describing the temple, Revelation chapter 11 introduces 2 witnesses, 2 individuals who will appear in Jerusalem during that 42-month period, prophesying, calling people to repentance, with power to shut up the sky and turn water into blood. For 3.5 years, they will stand in Jerusalem and declare the truth to a world that does not want to hear it. And the world will hate them for it. But they cannot be stopped, not until their appointed time is complete. Now why does that matter for us today? Because it tells us something profound about the nature of God. Even in the darkest period of human history, even during the tribulation, even when the Antichrist is desecrating the temple and the world is falling apart, God still sends witnesses. He still reaches out. He still calls people to himself. He does not abandon anyone without first giving them every possible chance to turn back to him. That is who God is. And that brings us to the most important part of everything we have discussed today. Because all of this, the high priest, the red heifer, the temple, the covenant, the timeline, all of it points to one central truth. Time is short. Not in a fearful way, not in a panic-inducing way, but in a sober, clear-eyed, wake up and pay attention kind of way. Because here is what we know. Jesus is coming back. That is not speculation. That is the consistent testimony of Daniel, Isaiah, Zechariah, Matthew, Paul, and John. Every major prophetic voice in Scripture points to a moment when Jesus returns to this earth. Physically, visibly, undeniably. And everything we are watching right now suggests that moment is closer than any previous generation has ever experienced. So what do you do with that? Here is what you do not do. You do not panic. You do not stockpile food and hide. You do not spend every waking hour calculating dates and timelines. Here is what you do instead. You get right with God. Not because you are scared, but because it is the only thing that actually matters. Because here is the truth that sits beneath all of this prophecy, beneath all of these signs, beneath all of these converging events. No earthly temple can do what Jesus has already done. The high priest in Jerusalem, as significant as his role is in prophecy, cannot stand before God on your behalf the way Jesus can. The red heifer purification, as remarkable as it is, cannot cleanse a human soul the way the blood of Jesus does. Hebrews 4:14 says it clearly. We have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. He is not preparing to enter the Holy of Holies. He has already been there. He sits at the right hand of the Father right now, interceding on your behalf today. Every temple that has ever been built, every sacrifice that has ever been offered, every high priest that has ever served, was pointing to him. He is the fulfillment of all of it. And if you have never surrendered your life to him, there is no better moment than right now. Not because the world is scary, but because he is real, and he is good, and he is worthy of your trust. If that is you, it does not require a complicated prayer or a religious ritual. It simply requires honesty. Tell him you need him. Tell him you believe he is who he said he is. And ask him to make your life his. That is it. That is the most important decision any human being can make, regardless of what happens in Jerusalem, regardless of what gets built on the Temple Mount, regardless of what agreements get signed in the Middle East. Your eternity does not hinge on a temple. It hinges on a relationship with the one the temple was always pointing to. Now, before this video ends, there is one final thing that needs to be said. Something that ties everything together in a way that will stay with you long after you stop watching. Because we have talked about what is happening in Jerusalem. We have talked about Daniel's timeline. We have talked about the high priest and the red heifer and the covenant. But we have not yet talked about what happens the moment after the abomination of desolation is set up. Daniel describes it. Jesus describes it. And what they describe is the most dramatic sequence of events in all of human history. Events that, according to the timeline we have been watching, could begin sooner than anyone is prepared for. The signs are in place. The pieces are assembled. And somewhere in Jerusalem right now, a man is ready to step into a role that will set the final countdown in motion. The only question left is, are you ready for what comes next?